I was tobogganing down a steep, icy slope in the middle of the night in Westendorf, Austria, with some friends. The skiing had gotten bad, and we were trying to figure out what to do. When suddenly, Richard Laram, known as Big Ugly, says, "I wonder what the conditions will be like on Kilimanjaro." What? It was like a slap in the face. Turned out he was going to take a Texaco oil tanker from Italy to Mombasa, climb Kilimanjaro, and then take the oil tanker back that April for free because his uncle worked for Texaco. Hey, can I come? Sure. I was practicing the bass in Denmark that year, getting ready to enter Juilliard in the fall. Hey, I deserve a break. This kind of opportunity may never come again. But after lots of correspondence, it turned out that the trip would take 3 months, not the 3 weeks we'd planned, and neither of us could do it. Now, I really needed something cool to do on my way home. I started thinking about hitching up through Sweden, Norway, taking a ferry to Iceland, popping over to Greenland, then taking the SAS flight that lands briefly in Sundestromfjord at the American Air Base to take on fuel, and then flies on to Los Angeles. Hey, I could hitch from there. Well, it turned out none of those connections were possible. So Gudrun, my Danish mother, says, "Why don't you just take a freighter from Copenhagen to Greenland and then catch that flight?" I thought about it for a minute. Yeah. 20 minutes later, she was off the phone with Den Kongelige Grønlandske Handel, and I had passage on the Anna Nielsen, sailing from Copenhagen to Greenland June 4th, 1965. There were only 3 other passengers. A crane assembler going to Sokotoppen to assemble a crane that we were carrying. A zoologist, Christian Wiebe, traveling with 14 young musk oxen, which he had captured a year earlier on the east coast of Greenland, and that after wintering at the zoo in Copenhagen were being taken to the west coast where there were none, to be set free to start a herd that would later feed the population living there. With him, from the zoo, was their caretaker, a zookeeper, Helge Ziegler Larsen. Without my knowledge, I had stumbled upon and was about to take part in an expedition of considerable import. The boat, the Anna Nielsen, was not much to look at, and it turned out so poorly loaded that in high winds the boat rocked only to one side. Unfortunately, instead of cradling me in my bunk, it dumped me out. We had a big storm rounding Cap Favel, and I was dumped out. So I set off for the bridge, hanging on to anything I could grab, and with some difficulty made it up there to watch the excitement. The zookeeper went out on deck in that hellish storm to check on his musk oxen. He kept slipping and falling, to the amusement of the first mate and the crane guy. I don't know how he kept from being washed overboard. The captain slept through the whole thing. I had learned Danish in 1962, so when I returned in the fall of 1964, I refused to speak any English, and except for the 2 weeks skiing at Christmas, didn't. I also read only in Danish, and thought only in Danish, and ended up dreaming in Danish. Fanatical, yes, but very effective. I passed for Danish, so everyone on the boat thought I was Danish. But they were really curious as to where I was going, and so after a few days I confessed that I was actually American. I was celebrated. The captain and passengers wanted me to eat with them, so did the mates and engineers, and so did the seamen. So I rotated through the three messes. Kaptein Jakob loved music of Handel. In his cabin, he had a record player hung on 4 strings from a single point like a gyroscope. He drank cherry herring, among other things. One amazing night, approaching the Arctic Circle, we had a sunset that lasted for hours, until it finally turned into sunrise. We drank cherry herring and listened to Israel and Egypt. I ran outside periodically for another picture. He told me that he would hide the bread after he baked it, because if he put it out fresh, it would be gone in half an hour. An amazing sight was a Portuguese fishing boat. The mother boat would send out scores of these little sailed dories to fish for sardines. Pity those poor fishermen when a sudden storm came up. The chief of police from Gothob, now called Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, linked up with us and sailed along to witness the historic setting in land of the musk oxen. It was lucky he did. I took one day and hiked out into the fjeld, as they called it. Rock, snow, and tundra. Beautiful. I was extolling the pictures I had taken at dinner when Wiebe said, "Ha, de ser dog alle sammen ens ud. They will all look the same." Made me mad. Sokotoppen was a great place to wander around. Because it was June and we were just below the Arctic Circle, it was daylight 24 hours a day. People and kids would go home and sleep when they felt like it, but there didn't seem to be any standard bedtime. There were always children playing. During the last few months in Denmark, I'd been playing Bach trio sonatas with a violinist and flutist. When I told them I was going home over Greenland, it turned out the flute player had a brother who was studying the aurora borealis in Sokotoppen. So he and I met and hung out a bit. He had a boat, and we went up the fjord a ways. Okay, this is the part that's hard to talk about. He was planning to walk from Sokotoppen to Gotthåb. The idea was to visit Viking settlements which had not been visited since the 1100s, when all the Vikings inexplicably disappeared, died, or went home. According to him, you would find the eggs still on the plate if they happened to leave during breakfast. Eventually, these settlements would be explored and preserved, etc., 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 but not yet. He asked me to come along. 2 months it would take. On my last night in Sokotoppen, I went back up to the lookout above the town and wrote a letter to Jan Gardner, my girlfriend from Northfield. First one in 3 years. She answered it that fall, but I never saw her again. We were sure we would meet sometime. But when I tried to find her some 15 years later, I learned that she had died of cancer in Greece. Not long after she'd sent me that letter. I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart of mine embraces all day through. In a small cafe, the park across the way, the children's carousel, the chestnut trees, the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you. The day of the great landing of the musk oxen got off to a poor start because the lifeboats were in rough shape aboard the Anna Nielsen. They finally got one in the water, but couldn't get the motor started. Yikes! The police chief, who was there with his wife and baby, eventually used his dory to transport the first crates. Everyone on the boat had become attached to the shaggy beasts, and all of us spent some time each day petting them through the slats in their crates. This was the second trip for Bibe, and in all he was responsible for landing 27 musk oxen. The zookeeper was wearing his uniform and cap for the ceremony, and was practically in tears, saying farewell to the animals. These young musk oxen are yearlings, having been captured as calves the year before. The method of capture was ingenious. Musk oxen form a circle facing out with the young in the middle when they feel threatened, but they only charge when the danger comes within a certain distance. So 2 people with a rope that has a noose in the middle walk to opposite sides of the circled herd, keeping beyond the charge limit, and laying it over the herd, get the noose around a calf and pull it out of the circle and beyond the charge limit. The adults are confused but don't know what to do. This was paid for by an anonymous woman donor from New York City. In 2010, the size of the herd was estimated at 4,000. Just before we reached the American Air Base, we crossed the Arctic Circle, so I got the certificate. I'd become friends with a young seaman named Jens, who was my age. So when we finally got to the American Air Base, he and I and a bunch of other seamen headed into town to look for a cafe. We found one. We're sitting there laughing, talking, drinking beer. And a bunch of American flyboys come in. Someone from our party went over to talk to them and say, "Hey, we've got an American over here." So a couple of them came over. They looked at me. I was dressed like a Dane. I looked like a Dane. I was talking Danish. And then when I answered them in English, it was not as fluid as it once was, out of practice. They didn't believe me. I am. Okay, if you're an American, who won the World Series last fall? I didn't have a clue. Hell if I know. Finally, I convinced them. And then all of us got together and closed that place down, and we invited them back to the boat, where it turns out, as a passenger, I could buy beer whenever I wanted. So we woke up the purser and I bought beer. It was a long night, even though it didn't get dark, and lots of fun. When they left, they invited all of us to come to the airbase tomorrow night. But when we showed up, they all had hangovers and nothing came of it. I still had some time before my SAS flight, and one day at lunch, a Danish lieutenant told me about an obscure American law that I had not heard of. Turns out any American marooned or stranded someplace will be flown home by the American Air Force for free. I could later turn in my ticket for a refund. So I presented myself at the airbase. An airman took me to a sergeant who put me in a jeep and drove me to the base commander, who was a major, I think. The major listened to my story. Stuck in Greenland, no money, had to get back to Hamilton, New York, like in my passport. Take this young man, find him a bed in the visiting airmen quarters. Don't tell anyone. Yes, sir! And you, Come back and see me tomorrow morning. Well, the next morning, the major said they could fly me to Goose and then to Gander, and there I could pick up a commercial flight to Montreal, being the closest place to Hamilton. But you'll have to reimburse the government for all three flights. Now it started not to seem all that worth it since I was on my way to the Aspen Music Festival, and Montreal is a whole lot further from Colorado than LA. I went back to the boat, ostensibly to get my stuff, and then came back and talked to the major. I told him I lied again. My uncle was going to wire me money and I could buy a ticket, blah, blah, blah. He was so relieved. It was almost comical. When I changed my money before getting on the plane, I discovered that I only had $5 to get me from LA to Denver. No sweat. I didn't change this one.